Welcome back everybody, and for something different we're going to be playing with the model of the month again. This is the first time that we have looked at a model that isn't actually in the 40k range. This is an Age of Sigmar Saurus warrior that has been made available, and I've got a bit of an idea that sort of continues on from the last video I did. And first things first, we're going to prime it, and I've used a combination of black primer, and for the shield I've mixed the metal and grey Stynylrez together to create a dark grey metallic sort of finish. And then we're going to give the whole model a zenithal prime to brighten it up a little so that it's not completely black. And the idea that we've got is, can we actually paint an entire model using the dirty down rust and moss rather than actual conventional acrylic paints? Now I understand that there will be a few little bits and pieces that you can't do, or you don't have the color range for, but we're going to give it a bit of a go to see what sort of results we can get and do a bit of a comparison. So a quick look at the model, and we can see there's a fair bit of texture on it, and it may well lend itself to putting on these paints because they tend to pool and accumulate, and so we just want to see what sort of finish we can get by applying it over the model. So starting with the dirty down moss seemed like a good choice given that lizards are generally green, and a thick application of that. Now they say to heat everything up before you start, and so I warmed the model and also the paint before applying it. Whether that makes a difference, I'm not too sure, and the idea is to create a liberal coating over the whole thing. And you can see that already there is a bit of variation that develops as a consequence of just how thick it is, and also the color of the base coat underneath. And here the chest is somewhat speckled rather than being completely black. I wanted a little bit of coloration on there, and just adding the paint on over everything, letting it pool if it wants to pool, just to see what sort of end result we get once everything starts to dry. It seems to be a little bit slower drying than the rust product, but it dries quick enough that you certainly don't have to sit around waiting for it. It flows out quite well. It seems to, because of the moisture content, spread relatively easily, so you get a pretty good coating. You do have to be careful obviously if you sort of go over things that you don't want. Now the whole point of these paints also is that they do happen to reactivate, and that can be a benefit for us, particularly where we've painted something we don't want to. Just go in with a brush with a bit of water on it and dab away, and you tend to mobilize that sufficiently that you can remove it. Now it's not a great idea to try and do that on an area that you want a solid continuous color, because you end up with a bit of a tide line that doesn't look particularly great. But if we want to change the appearance slightly, then perhaps let's go in and add a little bit more. It appears that with the moss dirty down product, the thicker it is, the darker it ends up being, and so just dabbing it on, going in and adding extra layers tends to change the consistency and the opacity of the paint, so we can make it look darker. You could also obviously just change the way you prime it, but this is the simple way to approach it, and you end up with a reasonably mottled looking appearance just by dabbing that on. So we get a little bit of texture and coloration across the model that you wouldn't otherwise get if you just applied one coat. Now this stuff really does act very much like a contrast paint. As you can see in the scales, it is somewhat dark where it has been quite thick and accumulated, so it does quite a lot of the work for you. Not that you'd normally probably approach it by painting a whole model with dirty down rust. Certainly not the rust, because it tends to have a more irregular finish, but I thought with the armor plating, a nice thin coat over the plates on the legs would look quite interesting, because it's already got the little groove there. And just the interesting thing is obviously around the edges there's a bit of overlap, and all it takes is a little bit of working with the brush, and you reactivate the color underneath so that you don't get an obvious sort of demarcation line, and it tends to blend a bit more. So that works relatively well. You just have to be a bit persistent with it. Going over the lighter color, when I did the previous video I used blacks and greys, but here I've used the zenithal prime, so that's a bit lighter. Interested to see what the rust looks like once that's done. So just running around and painting all the embellishments on the body, a couple of the spines, and we'll go back to that, but the finish wasn't the greatest. When you don't actually remobilize the paint underneath, it tends to be a bit blotchy. You can clearly see the colors underneath, and that's actually, if that's the finish you're looking for, it actually does work. But I wasn't overly happy with that, so I was able to go in and just reset that with adding a bit of water, and then just putting the color that you want back over the top again, and you tend to get a reasonably good finish. The armor and the weapon seemed like a good choice for the color, and these two colors seem to work relatively well, contrasting against each other. So fortunately these are the only two that I have in the range. There is verdigris, which is a lighter green that I'm aware of, but I've only got these two to play with, and in this instance it seems to be working out relatively well. You can see how quickly the material dries, and the club didn't look too bad, and the goal was to also put it onto the shield. The shield has more of a metallic finish, so it's probably going to look slightly different than the weapon, and I've just slathered that on relatively thickly, one coat only, and just make sure it is irregular in some respects because you'll get variation in the finish. We're not trying for perfection here. We want to have a mottled, blotchy look to the metal to give it the appearance that it has dried naturally. So here's me going back in again and just trying to remove some of the dark patches to give it more of a consistent look, particularly on these sort of two coverings on the spines. And it's just a matter of lightening them up and putting another coat over the top, and it pretty much does the job for you. Now this is about as far as you can get really using the two paints. If you want a model that looks like a model, we want to do a little bit with the detailing, and so we've got to resort back to using conventional paints. And I've got a range of acrylics, and I've also used a few little speed paints here as well. I've used the paint relatively thick in painting the ropes here that hold on the plates on the leg, because what I don't want to do is mobilize the dirty down product that's underneath it. If you sort of reduce your paint down, thin it with water or something like that, you've got more likelihood of reactivating the paint, and then obviously that color is going to come through and you're going to get a mixture. If you're after that, that will be perfectly fine. But if you want a solid coverage, then it's best to go a little bit sort of thicker with the paint. In the mouth, we need to add a bit of color, but I just wanted a universal sort of base for that, and the holy white, which looks more like grey, I thought would be useful. I know it's a speed paint, but I just wanted something that was going to sort of dull down everything in the mouth, so it was a universal color. It's okay to get a little bit of green showing through because it is a lizard, and I would imagine that a fair bit of the skin in and around the mouth would still be somewhat green. Now, in terms of highlighting the model, everyone always says, hey, let's do some highlighting, and what you can actually do is do a dry brush but with a wet brush, but not a saturated brush, actually using something that's just slightly damp. And if you've got just a small amount of moisture, you can actually start to remove some of the paint without being too crazy, and lighten it up so that you will get some degree of thinning of the paint, and therefore introduce some contrast so that it's not completely one color, and that works relatively well. And over the top of that, then I did actually apply a color just to sort of give it a little bit of variation. Finishing the mouth off with the red paint, just thinning that down a little bit. Again, it's going to mobilize some of that speed paint that I used, but we're just trying to go for a sort of a pinky color, and then playing around with the club. I thought it looks a little bit too uniform. Let's give it a bit of variety and just use the Zealot Yellow because it's on the same sort of tonings. It'll blend relatively well if I deliberately go in and activate the Dirty Down Rust and try and get it to mix. And so you get a sort of a variation in the way it appears. And using the same Zealot Yellow, I also detailed the eyes, and where I'd done the dry brushing to strip some of the colour off, I put that onto the edges of some of the more prominent scales to give it a bit of a staining colour, just to give it a bit of variety, see how that worked. And then finally went back in. I tried using the same over the teeth a little bit, but they looked a little bit too yellow and they blended in, and so I did some white over the yellow, and then at least you end up with a finish that looks kind of not completely stark white, because it's not going to have stark white teeth. Look at a Komodo dragon. They're a bit messy in the mouth, so I thought, yeah, a bit of dirt around there is going to look a little bit better. A little bit of detailing on the tongue. I've seen someone do that, so just a little bit of pink. And then a real dry brushing, just using some silver on the edges, just very, very carefully and exceptionally lightly, just dabbing it on to create a little bit of variation, and then just finishing off some of the details, just using a little bit of contrast paint on the jewels or whatever they happen to be on the armor plates, just to give it a little dab of color. And then lucky last, I bought myself some texture paint because in the previous video I thought that might have been useful when putting the Dirty Down Rust and also then painting with the contrast paint over the top to get it to pool in the texture rather than having a smooth finish. So I thought, oh, I'll just whack this on the base. One thing that I learnt was if you then try and dab paint things on it, it seems to lift off. Whether I actually should have primed the base before I put that on, I will try that the next time I use it, because obviously with paint you generally prime first. I thought I might be able to just put that straight on, but I tried putting some of the moss on and then gave it a little bit of dab of the rust to introduce the two colors of the model into the base, and in doing so lifted off some of the texture paint, revealing the black underneath. Fortunately it was speckled enough it didn't look horrendous, and then I dabbed some more rust over it to sort of disguise it, and then just whacked a few little tufts on the model, and we have the finished product, which the shield looks quite good. It's got that complete sort of rusty appearance, and for 95% of the bulk of the model being painted in two paints, you get a reasonable finish. Certainly if you're looking at doing something quick, and this is probably the quickest model I've painted, it certainly does that for you. It only took about a couple of minutes, maybe 4 or 5 minutes, to coat the whole model and then do the detailing. So all up I probably spent about an hour or so on this. For me that's pretty damn fast because some of the little bits were fiddly and I was doing a bit of experimentation. But certainly if you think that's a worthwhile exercise, it's been a bit of fun trying it. I know not many people are actually going to use this, but hey, that's what experimentation is all about. And thanks again for watching, and see you in the next one.